Now, of course, everybody understands the lack of democracy of the EU. It's sort of like an obvious point, isn't it? But of course, that's basically also an economic point, because if you don't control your laws, how can you control your economy and how your living standard develops, which is the most important thing to most people? Of course, everybody wants political freedom, but they also want economic freedom. And it's a pretty obvious point that the EU took away from us our political freedom. But what many people didn't understand was how they took away our economic freedom. And that they did in very specific ways. And what was explained in the referendum by UKIP and by those of us that tried to help UKIP in their task was that there was very specific exploitation of ordinary people. They were paying higher prices for things than they needed to pay. Quite a lot higher prices. We calculated the cost of living was 8% higher because of the EU. Now that seems like a very precise number, based on some estimates we made of how much the protection of the EU was, how much we were paying more for goods from all over the world because of EU protection. Now people talk about the customs union, and I'll come back to that. The customs union is the way the EU raises prices. It puts tariffs and other barriers in against producers from the rest of the world, and so it raises their prices. And we calculated it raises the price of food and manufactures by no less than a fifth, 20%. This is a huge number. And it leads to that calculation that the cost of living in Britain is 8% higher than it should be. Now, because of the EU. And of course, you see, that has knock-on effects, because our own producers who produce these things at these inflated prices are inefficient. And that's a further problem for our people, that productivity is lower than it should be. So high prices, low productivity, because there's less competition. And then you've got regulation. And regulation in the EU is extremely intrusive. The whole single market system intrudes into every part of our economy. You know, the labour market, climate change and energy, which industries, what the regulations are for industries, so that big business is favoured at the expense of small business. And finance. Our financiers are lumbered with all sorts of intrusive regulation from Brussels that is anti-finance. Because why? They don't have a financial industry in the EU. It's here, in London, which is the main financial centre of the world. So naturally the EU legislates with intrusive regulation to make sure that we're as inefficient as possible, that they lumber our financial industry with regulations that are not designed for finance. But then I come to the thing that is perhaps most important to ordinary people, which is unskilled immigration. Now, a lot of people said this is just sort of politics and sort of wrong hostility to foreigners. It couldn't be further from the truth. The British people are very welcoming to foreigners. We have always welcomed people from all around the world. But what happened in the last 15 odd years was a massive wave of unskilled immigration. Now the thing is that a lot of people who are on the other side of the debate said immigration's great, because look, we get lots of skilled people who come into Britain. Of course that's true. Nobody is against immigration as such. But if you subsidize unskilled immigration by what the EU made us do, which is 20%. I can tell you that we did the calculations on what it costs for an unskilled immigrant from the EU to come here. It costs every person in the UK £3,500 per unskilled immigrant. In NHS costs, education costs, housing costs, tax credits. And because they're unskilled, they don't pay any tax. So many people criticize UKIP for making a lot of this issue. But actually, it's probably the most important economic issue of all. Because another thing that we found out from research done by a colleague of mine, Professor Steve Nicol, for the Bank of England, was that a 10% rise in the supply of unskilled immigrants lowers wages for unskilled UK workers by 2%. And that's quite a big number. And if you then think about the fact that in poorer areas of our country, that's where unskilled immigrants go, of course, because that's where they can afford to have houses or pay rents. So what that means is that poorer people in our country suffer kind of, we estimate, from double the cost, because that's where they congregate. And so we calculated that poorer people in our communities, due to the combination of higher prices, of course food prices being importantly higher as a result of EU, because it protects food by this 20%, they suffer from a sort of triple whammy. First of all, the cost of living for them goes up 10% because they have a much higher proportion of food. Secondly, they're the people who are paying for the housing, the education, and the NHS costs in the areas where the unskilled immigrants from the EU go. And thirdly, because their wages are depressed by more than double the national average, because that's kind of where they all are. And so we concluded from this that the cost to a poor person in Britain of the EU from these factors was 15%. Now, you know, what we know about the referendum is that poorer people voted in large numbers to leave, totally rationally. Because what has been happening, you see, and UKIP was the only party to point this out. What's been happening is that the EU has targeted poor people indirectly through high prices, through a system of free migration that's totally unfair to poor people, to their wages, to their living, you know, to their cost of living, and to the burden that they have to bear in terms of public taxes, effectively, or lack of public facilities. Now we were, you know, we kind of did the economics of this, and we explained this point. And I have to tell you that this became a very sore point in the debate, because many people said, oh, migration has got to be good, but they missed the point. Skilled migration, which is what we need, of course, because, you know, we need skilled workers, and they pay their way. They pay taxes, they make a contribution to the economy. But the other side of the debate missed the point that for ordinary people, unskilled immigration is the problem. And somehow this didn't really come across in the debate, because, you know, well, we tried very hard towards the end to explain this point, that it's an economic point, and it's a point of basic economic injustice. That an elite who benefit from cheap immigrant unskilled labor should force poor people to pay for it.